Wonderful. Well, I think the next session is going to be moderated by another good friend and colleague, Professor Lopa Mudra Banerjee. Lopa was also part of the group, along with Sanjay and many others in the room, from India-China Institute Fellowship Program that looked at the issue of prosperity and inequality. So I'm delighted that she has agreed to chair this session. And while she may look very gentle, which she is, I think she will remind you that during the Q&A period, we really need to be, very disciplined. I think I would say, please, I know everyone has a lot of wonderful thoughts. Q&A period is really about very short questions. Please refrain from making commentaries, I know that they're important sometimes if we have time, but I would say brief questions. And same thing for the discussants and panelists. I'm sure they will stay within the time frame. I just wanted to add that extra, and I'm sure Lopa will enforce that too. Yes, I think I'll let her moderate, but really that's the request. I'm actually request coming from the audience to be very, very brief. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure and great honor to participate in this session, and I must thank the organizers for this excellent session. And we have been looking into causes and patterns and consequences of inequality and amidst prosperity in the morning session, and we shall continue with this theme in this session as well. And we have a very specific focus of analysis in this particular session. Mostly we will be talking with three economists talking about inequality from a perspective of economics. We have been talking about issues of poverty and inequality, and I'd like to know if the two issues would be separated in the discussions that we are going to have in this panel. We have Professor Yao Yang from Peking University, who'd be talking about globalization and inequality in China. We have Professor Azizur Rahman Khan, Emeritus Professor, University of California, Riverside, and my thesis advisor, to talk about the disconnect between global economic power and shared domestic prosperity in China. And we have Vamsicharan Vakulavaranam, my very close friend from University of Hyderabad, talking about inclusive growth or rising inequalities, India's economy in the neoliberal age. Evidently, we would be talking about issues of globalization and policies of a neoliberal state when we talk about issues of inequality, income inequality, and other forms of economic inequality in this session. And without much ado, may I then invite Professor Yao Yang to speak.
Okay, come in.
I suppose. I understand that each speaker would have about 15 to 20 minutes of time, and the time is going to be diligently kept.
Okay. It's always a great pleasure to come to the New School and attend those very interesting and stimulating conferences. When Sanjay asked me the topic, I said I'm going to talk about the globalization and the inequality in China. But I first want to say that I'm not anti-globalization, and actually China has benefited tremendously in the last decade or two from globalization. Think about the trade volume today. It's more than 5 times the volume when China joined the WTO. So a decade time increased by 5-fold. And globalization, as Sanjay Reddy alluded to, increased income of labor in China because China is abundant with labor, and globalization tends to reward the factor that's used the most. Okay. But having said that, I also want to say that globalization has this strong force to polarize the society. And today, specifically, I want to just tackle on one aspect of that, a very important one, that's the human capital formation. Okay. In the last section, our three panelists talk about the political side of economic inequality. But even with that, I would just say the market probably is the most striking and important force to polarize society. And also, India and China are both large countries, and large countries tend to be more unequal, just by nature, because you have just too many people, and by nature, you have more inequality. But globalization accelerates this process in China and also in other countries. Like in this country, in the United States, you see the effect of globalization. Several blocks are down in the south and several blocks up to the midtown. You see those two financial districts. And their income is very, very high. I think it's because, mostly I would say because of globalization, because those people who really have those kind of really high education. But in the meantime, I think also more importantly, is that their talents can be fully played off in a global stage, right? So they're kind of the cream of this society. Even with the same degree, say PhD, if you just happen to work as, say, I don't know, Iowa, right? You're not going to get the salary as those guys working in the financial district. The same thing happened in China. Globalization has created this kind of a cream versus the rest of the society. Right? We have people living in those coastal cities who just happen to have a very high education, so they can tap into the international resources and with very, very high income. Right? And then think about the rest of the country, then most people are left behind. Even with this kind of improving effect of globalization on all the labor are different. Right? You have those highly educated, and you also have those, say, migrant workers. Right? Among China's 150, some people say 200 million migrants, 80% of them only have a 9-year education or below, okay? Very, very low education. And their income seems is growing. But I would just say I have different opinion than most of the people saying. I think the increase of a minimum wage actually plays a big role to increase their salary. If you go to Shenzhen, recently I visited Shenzhen, I have a student working in the government, and he just showed me the calculation. It's just because the Shenzhen government raised the minimum wage to 1,250 yuan per month. Then those companies actually use this wage rate as the base rate to calculate the hourly wage. And then most of the increase of those migrant workers come from more working hours and also the increase of the minimum wage. So it seems that there is a shortage of labor, but I don't think it has taken a large bite to increase the income of those migrant workers. And if you look at the macro data, you see this lower mobility between generations in education. Okay, to give you just one personal experience, when I first went to Beijing University, the most elitist university in China, my class had 35 people. I would just say 1/3 of them came from really poor families. They had to rely on full government scholarship to live. We even had 2 orphans, right? So that's like 30 years ago. Today, my nephew is also in Beida, okay? And I asked him, do you really have classmates who come from really poor families? And he said, let me think about it. No, not a single person, right? So you see this kind of stagnation of intergenerational mobility. Then you tend to ask why. Why the intergenerational mobility of education declines so fast. So 3 factors are very important. First is the concentration of resources to the city, and even in the countryside, you find the concentration of educational resources from the villages to the city. We know that Zhejiang province is very rich, and Kelly just shows Wenzhou. I've been to Wenzhou. If you go to those cities in Wenzhou, county-level cities in Wenzhou, and you visit those schools, they're just magnificent, okay? And just, I would just say, too luxury for China's income level. But that's how they are built. But then if you drive, say, 20 kilometers away from the city center, you see a school that's still the standard of Guizhou province, the poorest province in China. So you see, even in this very concentrated area, you have this concentration of educational resources. Okay. And second is the higher cost of education in the countryside. Now, of course, one reason is just the inflation, right? Another reason, I think, also very important one, is the declining birth rate in the countryside. That's a little bit confusing why declining birth rate has something to do with cost of education. Actually, it matters a lot, okay? In the 1970s, now if we look at the data, in the 1970s, you see tremendous increase of the enrollment into primary school. I was one of those kids at that time. Right? Why is that? Some people, people on the left would say, oh, it's because of a Cultural Revolution, right? Cultural Revolution promotes elementary education. I actually have a very simple theory, okay? It's just because of so many children, right? We were born just after the Great Famine, right? There was kind of a baby boom. Then by the time of the early 1970s, there were so many kids. And then the government could afford to build a school in almost each village. I still remember, I went, first year I went to school, we had to walk 1.5 kilometers. And we have to do this twice a day, right? Morning and after lunch. I mean, for a kid of 6 years old, it was too much, right? So the next year, this is just our village built our own school. So we walked there only in 10 minutes, right? So that increased the supply of education, and that tremendously lowered down the cost of education. Today, the reverse trend is happening because of declining birth rate. Schools have to be consolidated. So our village was lucky because we had one guy, working in the government, and this guy just happened to have power to, should I say, coerce a company to build a school, a larger school in our village. So kids from our village can still walk to school. But you look around, about 10 villages around us, their schools were all eliminated and consolidated in just one school, which means those kids have to go to that school and be a boarding student. That increased tremendously of the cost to those poor farmers. They have to pay cash, okay, when they send the kids to boarding schools. And also the nutrition intake is far below adequate. Scott Roselle, who's running kind of a very interesting program in Stanford, and he said in poor regions of China, half of the students, elementary students, have a low, what's it called, 贫血, anemia. Okay, okay. That's actually very serious. Half. And by China's income standard, it should happen, but it happened. Then the third factor is quite, I call it paradoxical consequences of increasing wages. Okay, even with 9-year education, now if you go to work in a factory, you can earn 2,000 yuan per month. And if you just happen to have a high school education, you're going to earn a little bit higher. And you do the calculation, right? If you send your kids to university, you have to pay tuition. Actually, there is kind of a regressive system in China. In elite schools like our university, the tuition is actually very low. It's only 5,000 yuan per year. But if you go to the third-tier university, the tuition is much higher. It could be 20,000 yuan per year. And most of those rural kids end up in the third-tier university. Right? This is also a story of another niece of mine. He got admitted to a third-tier university, and he refused to go because he sensed it's too much a cost for his parents. So he fled home, and he went to Guangdong to become a factory worker. Okay, but I said, no, you have to come back. You have to go to university. So he went back to the university anyway. But you see that's the point over there. Right. So then, as an economist, I always have confidential discussions with economists. Even with our center, my colleagues, including quite distinguished economists, when they talk about the inequality, they always say, oh, wait a minute, it's because the market is not freed up. If we can have more market liberalization, we're going to have more equal income distribution. Don't worry, right? That's where typical. That's actually where typical for Chinese economists, especially the elite economists in China. Their argument is that the people are going to invest in education if education pays. Education really pays, but I don't think that's going to automatically happen. We need government actions. And in this regard, I think we have to give credits to Chinese government. The government just announced this Education 2020 plan. And by 2020, 40% of China's young people are going to be in university. That's very, very high. And then this year, perhaps this year, education spending is going to reach 4% of GDP. There is a law actually mandated in the government to do this. Okay. And migrants are now allowed to send their children to local schools. Okay, and the Ministry of Education is going to have a new policy to allow migrant children to take college entrance exam in their recipient provinces. So currently, they have to go back to their home provinces to take the college entrance exam. That's just ridiculous. Those kids were born, say, in Beijing, but they had to go back to their home province to take the exam. So those are kind of the moves that the government have taken to improve education in China. But I would argue that they're not enough. They're not targeted enough. The government's approach is still quite elitist. For example, the Education 2020 plan is going to put a lot of resources into formal education. The plan is to have formal education from kindergarten onward to university education. But I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think that's going to help those people who really need government support. Think about those families living in Shanghai, Beijing, or any other big cities. I don't think they really need government support. They understand the importance of education. The problem is really with those low-income people in the countryside. So the government should have more targeted policies and concentrate the resources, public resources, for those really, really poor people. And another group, a large group of people that have been ignored by the government is actually those migrants. The number is just huge. As I said, their education is inadequate. Okay, Scott there shows us the picture. In 10 years' time, the wage rates of those migrants are supposed to catch up with the current level of, say, a Portugal worker. But their education is not as high as a Portugal worker. Right? But I don't think they're going to drop back into school. Right? The government should spend more money to do on-job training and to subsidize the education of those light schools, those kinds of things. But now, because the Ministry of Education controls all the resources, and those people are not their responsibility. Those people are the responsibility of the Ministry of Social Security and Labor. And that ministry has no resources to do this kind of work. In the end, I would just say, it could be a long story. I think we all know that the Chinese government is authoritarian, and the authoritarian government, by nature, will grow more elitist. Okay, although the Communist Party started with kind of a grassroots party, but in the end, it has become so elitist. And no wonder its policies have become quite elitist driven. I think this is not going to work in the new area of China's economic growth, even for the sake of economic growth. Of course, if we think about other broader objectives that we talk about today, that's even more inadequate. I'll stop here. Thank you.
While Professor Yao Yang was talking about the polarization forces at play in China, especially in terms of returns to human capital and education and government spending in that regard, Professor Khan is going to talk about the role of economic power and sharedness of domestic prosperity.
Thank you. Unlike the two other people who have spoken on China today, I'm an outsider, which means I don't speak Chinese, I'm not Chinese, and my fieldwork in China is somewhat dated, like my picture in the program. Which means that I won't be going into many interesting details that they each talked about, and which also means that I'll probably end up asking more questions than answering. Okay, my first point is that China's emergence in the international economy in the last 3 decades, over the last 3 decades, has changed the international economic balance of power completely. China has emerged as the second largest economy in the world from rural backwaters. It has become the largest exporter of goods in the world, while at the time it launched reforms, it was an inward-looking economy with virtually no exports. Its foreign reserves now is, the last figures I looked up, over $3.3 trillion, which is more than the total reserves of Japan, the Eurozone, including the European Central Bank, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, the next 4 groups of countries taken together. And of course, its net external assets are close to $2 trillion. Don't look at my PowerPoint for everything that I'm saying. Those are very sketchy. Only tell you about the main headings. So these indicators of international economic power are very impressive. And these have altered the balance of power, as I said. But the point is that the welfare of the citizens and the prosperity of Chinese people do not depend on these international indicators. They depend on things like per capita personal income, per capita consumption, at what rate these things have been growing. And there is a very big disconnect between the international indicators and these. For example, if you simply take per capita GDP, then over the period from 1981 to 2010, it's increased by nearly 11 times. But then when you look at per capita personal income and consumption, they increased by less than 7 times. That's because the GDP elasticity of household or personal income has been rather low in China. But that's not the whole story. This personal income has also come to be distributed far less equally now than it was at the time the reforms were launched. Now here, I'm just making a speculative kind of estimate. It's not backed by actual data. It's my hunch that the bottom 20% or 25%, their per capita personal income over this period increased by something like 3 to 4 times. Now that is very substantial increase, and this allowed China to reduce poverty very substantially. But then it pales in comparison with those indicators of international economic power. And this is what I'm going to talk about, why this disconnect. The reason that this has happened is, actually it can be summarized in 2 trends. First, that GDP elasticity of personal income has been rather low. And the second, inequality has increased very, very sharply. But shouldn't we be asking this question, is it anything special to China? These things are happening everywhere and has happened everywhere all the time. We know that in developing countries, capital accumulation grows faster than consumption. That is indeed true. But the point is that in China, this has gone rather far. If you can see this data, you will find that consumption, household consumption as proportion of GDP, peaked at around mid-1980s at 52%, and by 2010 it has fallen to 33.8%. The comparable figure for India today is about 55%, in Brazil just over 60%, and you may know that in this country it's over 70%. Now that's the kind of extreme reduction in the ratio of household consumption to GDP has taken place in China. The other thing is increase in inequality. Now, this morning, the speaker showed that Gini ratio for China before reforms began was 0.17. I trust that this is the urban one. For China as a whole, it was way above that. And my hunch is that it was somewhere between 0.25 and 0.3. And by the end of about 2 decades of reform, it came to be about 0.45. Now, since then, it may have increased somewhat more. I think the main increase in inequality took place in the first 2 decades after reforms. And then again, the question is, hasn't it risen everywhere? It's true that over the last 3 decades, inequality has risen everywhere, unlike the 3 decades before that, when growth everywhere was more inequality averse. With the exception of Latin America, over only last 7-8 years, inequality has actually increased everywhere. But the important point here is that China is supposed to have followed a strategy which was adopted by the East Asian pioneers like Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Taiwan, where export-led industrialization led to a very highly equalizing growth. How come that China, following basically the same strategy, ended up with this remarkable increase in inequality? So these are the 2 things that I need to focus my attention on. And okay, but this first one, we go back to the 3 questions I want to ask. What have been the major factors behind those? Those very quickly, I'd like to summarize some outstanding reasons why this happened. Some of these have been discussed already by the 2 speakers. First of all, when you embark on reform, you actually move away from socialism, orthodox Marxian kind of socialism, to market-based capitalism of some kind. Forces of inequality are necessarily unleashed, like you do away with the wage structure, which was highly disincentive creating during the Maoist regime, and that automatically leads to greater inequality. You do away with collectivization and allow private enterprise, and people's differences in people's productive ability, labor supply, these things get reflected, and that leads to inequality. So it was inherent in the systemic reform. But there can be offsetting factors. And the point is that in China's case, those offsetting factors did not take place. And let me very quickly highlight some of the important ones. The most important one is that growth in this case, despite what Sanjay Reddy said this morning, is reasonably employment intensive, so that employment intensive industrialization allows labor to be moved out of low productivity agriculture, and that leads to egalitarian distribution of income at the margin, because those people who move out of agriculture are low income people. The point is that in China, this mechanism completely broke down, unlike its predecessors in East Asia. Not because the new export industries were not creating employment, they were. But the point is, for the industrial sector as a whole, there was no employment creation at all. The reason is this, that at the time, during the Maoist era, at the time reforms started, the huge state enterprises historically stored labor as a concealed system of unemployment insurance. And as reform went ahead, they had to move away from that, and they started shedding labor like mad. So for the sector as a whole, industrial sector as a whole, there was very little creation of employment. See, so together, it was not absorbing labor at all. So agriculture's labor shedding, it actually stalled. I'll be showing some figures later on. So that's one important reason. Then another was that China's public finance, taxes and subsidies, they were very regressive even under Maoist regime. Within the rural sector, between the rural and urban sector. So, and during the reform process, they became even more regressive. Why? Because in the reform process, they did away with the equalizing components of subsidies first, food subsidy and so on. And it's only much later, towards the end of the century, that the more disequalizing elements like housing and so on were dismantled. So that increased inequality of the first 2 decades. Then, well, okay, urban-rural inequality, a lot has been spoken about it, and that indeed was one of the very important factors. Initially, actually, it fell. I haven't got it in the table. Initially, urban-rural inequality actually fell. That's because terms of trade were moved in favor of the rural economy, and rural economy actually had entire development strategy initially was based on rural development, and the rural economy was able to productively employ labor to a much greater extent, and urban-rural inequality declined. I think the figure in the first column was in the first column here, it was somewhere like something like 1.7, fell actually from something over 2. But then what happened was that the terms of trade for agriculture were turned against it, starting about the mid-1980s. And also agriculture received relatively much less resources than the rest of the economy. And you can see what happened there. Starting from there, the productivity gap between agriculture and the non-agricultural sector increased very sharply. These things show the ratio of the share of employment to the share of GDP. And it moved from about 2 to a peak of very close to 4, 3.84. So there was a huge productivity gap. The rest of the economy, there was very little change in that. See? So there's a huge productivity gap between the sectors. And this was exacerbated by such factors as the restriction on migration. So then there was the regional inequality. That was exacerbated because the entire focus on export growth. And finally, the phenomena that I've talked about, the elasticity, GDP elasticity of household income and consumption actually fell. Okay. What could China do? Could it do otherwise? Yes. And here I'm actually giving a list of the things that it could do. For example, when it moved away from collectivization to individual farming, there were some countervailing reforms implemented, like land reform, equal access to land, and that helped limit inequality in the rural economy. But elsewhere, it was not done. I've just listed some of the things. Freeing of the wage structure in the industries could have been backed up by much easier access to skills and education. Actually, the complete opposite happened. laying off of workers in state enterprises could be backed up by the creation of a transparent system of unemployment insurance and creation of social safety network. This was not done. Legalization of private enterprise could be backed by credit and resources for small enterprises. That was done, not enough and far too late. The regressivity of the tax system, this could be reformed. Actually, if it could simply be made neutral, then inequality would have been far less. The shift of public investment to this western and central provinces, this could have taken place much earlier. There was some of it actually towards the turn of the century. And the increase in urban-rural inequality could have been arrested by a variety of measures, greater investment for rural areas, but most importantly, allowing migration and ending discrimination against the migrant workers. And finally, the elasticity of personal income and consumption with respect to GDP, it could have been liberalized earlier. That didn't happen. Now, I shall, and I don't have time, I shall focus on last two of these things. What actually happened there? The urban-rural inequality, see, the main thing is the labor absorption in non-agricultural sectors. Here are the data. You can see what happened. Today there was a mention to this very large shift, reform in state enterprises starting about 1997. You can see what happened. Employment in agriculture, actually absolute employment started falling starting 1991. To about 1996 it fell, but then the trend was reversed. Quite a remarkable phenomenon. The reason is industries which were creating sub-employment starting from after 1996, 97, it actually had a reduction in employment. Now, over these 5 years, industrial output increased by 55%, and industrial employment actually fell by 5%. So what happened was agriculture's getting rid of labor, it was reversed in this period. See? Now, from about 2002, things improved. From 2002 onwards, agriculture has been shedding labor at about 3% per year, 3.3%. Industrial employment has been growing about 4% per year, services about 2.7% per year. Now, these are not great figures because, again, output elasticity of employment in industry is only 0.4, in services 0.27. See, that's not very much. But then, if this can continue until 2020, then agriculture's employment, share of total employment can fall to 16%. And I think, if China can follow that trajectory, then there will be a bit of tightening and urban-rural inequality can actually shrink. Now, the other thing, this is much more disturbing. Just look at what happened. Actually, it kept falling steadily, it stabilized a bit, which is extremely counterintuitive. That's when employment was falling, but that's when it was stabilized until about 2002, and then it crashed, it fell. That's when it was possible for China to liberalize consumption. but it fell. And the reason is, you see, remarkable. When export surplus actually started falling at the beginning of the international crisis, world crisis, look what China did. Actually increased investment even more. By 2010, China did something quite remarkable. I don't know of any country ever having done that. Investment, domestic investment exceeding aggregate domestic consumption, private and public together. See, so this opportunity given by the international crisis, that is a reduction in huge export surplus, this was wasted in further increment in public investment rather than using those resources to liberalize consumption and creating a social safety net. I'm sorry, I've exceeded my time. I'll see if I can deal with more of the things when questions are asked.
While Professor Khan's presentation raised this issue of whether the emergence of a state at the world stage is shared, the prosperity of the state at the world stage is shared by the nationals of a country, of that state. I suppose Vamsi's presentation is also going to speak to that issue, and I know that he had been working on comparative analysis of the East Asian phenomena at the early stages and the difference between that and what is happening in China and India now. In fact, it will speak well to the instance that Professor Khan was talking about when he mentioned that how different is the new experience of India and China is from the earlier erstwhile experiences of the East Asian pioneers. Vamsi.
Thanks, Lopa. I would like to thank India-China Institute. It's always a pleasure to come here for one more meeting. Before I start, let me say a couple of things. My presentation is very similar to Professor Kohli's presentation. And I was quite amazed because, we come from two completely different disciplines and we have broadly the same arguments. And we're also working in very different locations. So the story must be right. That's So, the broad motivation, I think, we should focus on inequality as opposed to an exclusive focus on poverty, in order to understand whether inclusive growth is happening or not. And I think several speakers already have talked about the Kuznets curve, and its questionable, validity, for various experiences in the recent past. I think, Kuznets, if you read the original paper, Kuznets, his method is absolutely on the mark. He followed a political economy method. He looked at, what Professor Khan just talked about, migration from rural to urban areas and how that contributed to a reduction in inequality. But he also looked at political resistance from working classes in England and US and so forth. And he also looked at the emergence of the welfare state, which is a fairly recent early 20th century phenomenon. But he captured, I think, a particular regime, where inequality levels were going down. And this goes back to what Professor Kohli talked about earlier. I think there are different regimes of capitalism, some regimes and some policy structures which tend to reduce inequality, and certain regimes or policy structures which tend to heighten inequality. I think we need to be careful not to make any overarching conclusions. Kuznets did not make such a conclusion. In fact, he was very tentative in his discussion of his findings. But economists have thrown out political economy, the tentativeness, and reduced it to a law, which economists tend to do. All right, so I think, different social contradictions ought to be focused on in order to understand inequality better. And my focus is going to be on class. Very similar again to what the conclusions that Professor Kohli got. I personally think, looking at the rich literature that has come out from China, there are many experts of Chinese inequality in this room. Professor Riskin is here. Of course, Professor Khan just spoke. And Yao Yang, discussed inequality. There are several experts. Very few good analyses of Indian inequality are available. And this is strange. I think we need to correct that. If you look at the broad experience, Indian experience with growth and inequality, I think you get broadly three regimes. One regime between 47 and 80, which is a low growth, moderate inequality kind of regime. But it hides, between 47 and 64, I think industry was growing rapidly and then it stagnates, whereas agriculture takes off after 1964. So it hides certain complexities. But overall, if you look at the regime, it's low growth and moderate inequality. 80s is a very interesting decade in India. Growth takes off in around 79, 80. 80, 81, it intensifies. I think, a lot of people have commented on it. Professor Kohli's work also, the change in Indira Gandhi's attitude towards the business community and so forth. But what is really interesting is inequality doesn't take off, with high growth. And this goes back to what Lopa was commenting earlier. High growth doesn't necessarily have to increase inequality. Apart from the regime's argument that I just brought in, look at some of the empirical cases of East Asia. Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Initial period, Japan after 50s, inequality actually fell with increasing growth. So there is no inevitability. When people say, well, this is a part of the development process, I think it's just a lazy kind of comment. And you move to the next regime. In the 90s and 2000s, you see a continuing growth process, but inequality takes off. Inequality starts rising rapidly. So there are two different regimes after 1980, after India gets into a high growth phase, and it's important to distinguish between the two. Broadly, I'm going to use the National Sample Survey. I don't need to explain in detail, but this is almost 3 decades of what happened to inequality in India. And of course, there are all kinds of biases with the National Sample Survey data. The upper end groups are not adequately sampled. So, the top 1% I don't think is captured at all in the NSS data. And I'm going to focus on class, so owners and managers, people who live off the surplus. One of the surpluses that Sanjay was referring to earlier. These groups are not adequately represented. So the implication clearly is that, and apart from this, it's also consumer expenditure as opposed to income. And we know that, poor tend to consume all of their income, rich don't. They save a lot more of their income. So when you look at consumption, inequality tends to be understated. I also use a methodology, I don't need to explain that. If anybody has any questions, called Shlomo-Itzhaki methodology to decompose Gini into 2 parts. Usually Gini is decomposed into 3 parts, but Shlomo-Itzhaki presents a different methodology through which you can decompose Gini into 2 parts. The within group inequality and the between group inequality. So broadly, what is the story from the 80s? What you get is, in 1983-84, the Gini is fairly low, but this is the consumption Gini. Income Gini could be higher. It's around 0.327, and it's stagnant, through the 80s, or it declines mildly. And then between 93 and 2009-10, this is the latest survey in India. Inequality takes off. Most of the people who know anything about Gini know that it's a very sluggish coefficient. China and India, Gini has risen tremendously, which means that something deeper is really getting transformed. And the first focus is, so what's happening along the rural-urban axis? In 83-84, as you can see, if you focus on the first column and you focus on the third row, the between component between rural and urban, contributed to around 8% of the total inequality in 83-84. And by 2009-10, it rises to around 21%. But what is interesting is, there are 2 things here that I want you to focus on. Between 80s and 90s, already you see the rural-urban gap rising. Okay, so then it constitutes a puzzle. Why is it that overall inequality is not increasing, although rural-urban gap is rising? And in the 90s and 2000s, you see a further increase in the rural-urban gap. So that's one of the things. But the answer to the puzzle is also clear from the data. If you look at the within component, within urban and within rural component, in between 83 and 93, the within component, within rural and within urban component of inequality, that has gone down quite substantially, and that is what is really keeping the inequality level stagnant, during that period, although the between component has risen. And between 90s and 2009-10, the within component has risen, especially within urban inequality, intra-urban inequality has risen. But if you compare the absolute figures there, the within component in 1983-84 is still higher than the within component in 2009-10. This is something to keep in mind. The second, axis, again, Professor Kohli actually gave a detailed account. I'm not going to do that here. But if you look at the broad story of decomposition, in the 80s, 83, 84, only about 6.5% of the total inequality is explained by the between state component. And by 2009-10, around 17% of the total inequality is explained by the between state component. So interstate inequality is rising, and that's a story I think everybody knows now. The third thing I want to focus on in this paper is looking at class frameworks. Do they have something different to offer? Do they have a richer story to tell? And I experiment with two class schemas. We actually, Wei Zhong, who was my partner in the second cohort of India-China Institute Fellowship, and I developed these frameworks together when we were in Japan doing a 3-month research project. We played with two class structures, and we used them both for China and India. We have very interesting results for both countries. The first schema is a simplified class structure, and the second one is a detailed class structure. So if you focus on the urban, the simplified class structure, we looked at categories of social consciousness or identification, and in this schema, you get two classes broadly in urban spaces. One is the urban elites who make up the different classes, owners, managers, and also the professionals, software workers or pharma workers, etc. That's the urban elite. And then you have the urban working class, which is the majority in urban spaces. And in the detailed urban structure, what we do is we make a fundamental distinction between workers and non-workers. And within workers, we make a 3-tier distinction among professionals, skilled workers, and unskilled workers. Broadly, it speaks to what Sanjay Reddy was talking about earlier, although we make a 3-tier distinction. And we also separate services and manufacturing. I think these two sectors have very different sets of inequality dynamics. And in rural class structure, in the simplified scheme, I put no significant land reforms in India, including West Bengal and Kerala, mainly because we were comparing China and India when we developed this this schema, and it makes a huge difference. For China, we had one class called peasants, but in India, you have multiple classes. Rich peasants, middle peasants, small peasants, marginal peasants, and then landless workers. But I club the rich peasants with money lenders, merchants, the rentier classes, landlords, etc., and put them under rural elite. Then you have small peasants, agricultural and non-agricultural workers. Let me skip the detailed rural scheme and look at the results. If you look at the simplified class structure, the between class story in 1983-84 explains almost 14%, much higher than the rural-urban or interstate component. By 1993-94, it rises further to around 21%, and by 2009-10, the between class story tells you describes almost 28% of the total inequality in India. But what is remarkable is, if you actually look at the absolute numbers, the increase in the between component from 0.047 to 0.102, that explains almost the complete increase in inequality between 0.327 and 0.370. So the between class component is really explaining almost the entire increase in inequality in India during this period. And if you look at the detailed class structure, the story becomes even more persuasive in the sense that in 83-84 it's around 17%, the between class component, and by 2009-10 about 33% of the total inequality is explained by the between class component. Again, compare the absolute values, and here it completely explains the rise in inequality, right? So the class story is, I think, at the bottom. This is a difficult slide to read, but I want you to focus only on see, these are the simplified classes in the first column, and what I do is I take these 3 years that I'm looking at, 1983-84, 93-94, and 2009-10, and I have the comparable values of consumption expenditure of these different classes, the average consumption expenditure of individuals in each different category, and the second column against each year is the ratio to mean. What is the ratio of the class average to the population mean? That's what you get in the ratio to mean column. And what we do is, we look at what happens to changes in this ratio to mean. So that gives you an understanding of who has really made the relative gains, during this entire period, 3 decades of the experience about inequality in India. And you focus on the very last column. The urban elite has made relative gains of around 36%. Urban workers have made a relative gain of only 3%. And you look at all the rural classes, they've basically endured relative losses. So what you get is a very, very skewed story from this picture. Even if you just look at the simplified class schema, it's the urban elite that has garnered, all the relative gains through the growth process. And this is the basic story in the Indian case. And the urban workers have made relative gains, but, they're not significant at all. So the summary, in terms of the basic results, Indian inequality increases, exhibit the following features. Increasing rural-urban gap. I showed you the numbers. I didn't talk about it. It's around 2 now, according to the latest survey. And if you look at the income data from China, I just looked at Professor Li Shi's paper from the latest survey. Chinese rural-urban gap is over 3.5. But that's an income, based analysis. So maybe there are, some puzzles there. But there's also an increasing intra-urban inequality and increasing interstate inequality. But the strongest and the richest explaining factor, for the rise in inequality is the interclass story. So that is the main thing. And all these inequality dynamics, interestingly, except the overall increase, the between story, in rural, urban, or interstate, or in class, are already there in the 80s. They get much more pronounced in the 1990s. So that's one interesting part. And when you do a decomposition of Gini, you can also look at stratification processes. If certain classes are getting stratified by looking at something called the overlapping index that Gini decomposition produces, and you see a stratification of urban elite at the top, and you see the stratification at the bottom also of agricultural workers who are the poorest, in India. And there's also an emergence, and this needs to be analyzed very carefully, of a very numerous non-agricultural rural population, workforce basically, and we need to do a lot more work, I think, to understand what this would be doing. This is not like the TVE story, township and village enterprise story in China. There's no structured kind of development story that's emerging there. But they're leaving agriculture and joining the non-agricultural workforce, and some of them then come to the informal sector in urban spaces. So broadly, to come to explanations, these are my the conclusions. Indian economy has been witnessing inequality-inducing rapid economic growth, especially since 1990s. And the causes, I think, people have gone into the causes already. There's a major slowdown in the agricultural sector, even as the other sectors have shown remarkable growth. And you also see this in the manifestation of a large number of farmer suicides, uneven across the country, but it runs into several thousands now. The high growth sectors, unlike the Chinese case, as Professor Khan pointed out, I think China created enough jobs, but Indian high growth sectors have not created enough jobs. But there are increased absorption rates in the informal sector and the rural non-agricultural sector. That's something that's visible, but it's not in any. This is not happening in any planned way. This is just an unplanned kind of process. And overall, if you have to look at inequality, especially in urban spaces, I think it's a rapid surplus extraction story. Productivity levels are growing rapidly, in the high growth sectors, but wage increases have not kept pace. So what it means is the gap between productivity increases and wage growth, is pocketed by, the owners or managers or, people who extract the surplus. So profits rise much faster. And there's also an unequal exchange, I think, between the formal and informal sectors. If you live in Hyderabad or any city in India, you will know that, when a domestic maid comes and works for you, the kinds of wages you pay the domestic maid are much, much lower than what you would pay if, it was more of an organized kind of sector. So I think, the people in the organized sector get subsidized by, people in the unorganized sector. I think that's one of the causes. And there's also, as it has been pointed out, to use David Harvey's phrase, accumulation through disposition, a lot of peasants are being kicked off their lands, and state resources have been privatized. Commons are being privatized rapidly across the country. And there's also, this is a period of intense speculation, both in the stock markets in India, but also in the real estate. So to conclude, I think there's a broad, if you look at the political forces at work, the political economy, I think there's a new dominant class coalition in India. I think the urban capitalist classes are really calling the shots, and the urban middle classes have been recruited to support the urban capitalist classes. And in most cases, the rural elites have urbanized themselves, although you see a negative sort of relative, or they're making relative losses. Many of them are in the process of joining the urban elites. So they don't really lose out. They're urbanizing themselves. But this is the broad coalition. And I think there's also a redrawing of the relation between the state and the classes from an earlier dominant class coalition of Pranab Bardhan, where the middle class, which was behind the state, played a key role. I think the state supports the dominant class coalition and abets accumulation by disposition. Of course, it also throws some programs at the poor, like what Professor Kohli talked about, like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, etc. And that's good. I think it's a good scheme. But I don't think it's actually going to lead to inclusive growth by itself. I think the kind of growth India is undertaking is fundamentally exclusionary. And it's definitely not like the Swedish model, or although people are talking about inclusive growth now, it's not the people's home. Where in Sweden in the 40s, you saw this agricultural population, state, business community, coming together with urban working classes, and some kind of an accommodation was worked out among these four classes. I think this is a very clear case of skewed urban elite kind of development. And it's also an enclave kind of development. The prosperous, feed into the growth process, and the growth process feeds into the prosperity of the urban elites. Thank you.
This was a very exciting discussion, and if I may paraphrase the main trends of discussions that was going on, as Professor Khan mentioned, that there is inherent processes of inequality involved if there are capitalistic market-based growth processes to be followed. So inequality would inherently, economic inequality would inherently follow such processes. And then we learned about two particular processes of polarization, both focusing on urban elite vis-a-vis rest of the nationals of a nation, in case of China and India. Professor Yao Yang talked about the role of urban elites in the education education system and the bias of the human capital formation for this group. And Vamsi talked specifically about processes of class formation, and in both the cases we learned about processes of accumulation and about dispossessions, which are leading into inequality. Now, this had been an interesting session in the sense the focus had been not on poverty, but on inequality. And inequality is recognized as the more important sphere of conflict within these two emerging nation states. Yet, it is really the poverty reduction focus of the two states that we see everywhere. And all the policies of the state had been focusing on poverty reduction and championing, again, the gains in terms of poverty reduction. I hope that some of the questions from the audience would really speak to this issue. Once again, I'd like to remind you, do please introduce yourself when you ask the question. Do please be precise with your questions. And about the greater commons and discussions, there will be space, and I think Mr. Prem Shankar Jha is going to be more liberal than I would be in this session. Let's take the questions.
Prem Shankar Jha. I have a brief question for Vamsi. In an outstanding, first of all, let me congratulate you on your presentation. The class definitions is a thing that makes almost anyone uneasy, but broadly, everything you've described for me fits in with my anecdotal and sort of observational experience of India over the last 20 years. I have two questions for you specifically. One is the cash income component. You see, at the base of your calculations, cash income is such a large part, but it varies according to the strata. For example, it's a large part in the rural, non-agricultural sector. It's a very large part in the, and it's because a lot of it is services. You can't say we produce so much per acre, therefore you could give a rough estimate of income. Then in the urban, it's a very large part of the elite, but the largest part is in the informal sector. And that secondly brings me to the question that, in your definition of classes, you have not divided the urban by informal and formal. And I think that I would suggest that you can do it quite easily, I'm sure, that you add that one more distinction to your thing. And I'd like to hear, at least impressionistically, what you think would happen if you took the cash income thing more into account, or if it's already done, but if it's not been done, and if you brought it into the informal sector. Thank you very much.
The gentleman at the front row, do please introduce yourself.
Malcolm Arnold with Ruby Newby. My question is for Professor Khan. You, on the slide where you showed consumption going from, let's say, 34 to 52, in the middle of the slide there was also investment. And that basically was an inverse ratio as far as following exactly from the opposite, from 36 to 52, whereas before it was consumption was 52 to 36% of GDP. So was that investment, was that private or public? Because you can either consume or invest. And so the investment was inversing compared to the consumption. So is that public or private? And how does that lead to inequality if it is inversing in that in those ratios?
Sanjay?
A very quick question for the whole panel, prompted by Professor Khan's counterfactual thought experiment. What were the political and social factors that militated against some of those alternatives being pursued?
Professor Riskin?
Yeah, I'd like to thank the panel for three really excellent presentations. All three were very enlightening. One of the things I liked about Aziz Khan's presentation was that he linked the problem of growing structural imbalances of perhaps unprecedented size with the problem of inequality. My question, though, is really directed at Yaoyang. who we're so lucky to have here today. But it's relevant to the imbalance inequality nexus. Yao Yang spoke about at the very end of his talk, the growing elitism of the party perspective, point of view. And yet, if you look at the attempt to rebalance the economy that's been going on over the last 2 5-year plans, and to make the growth model more equitable and more responsive to the needs of the poor and the rural population, it seems as if most of the initiative for those efforts has been coming from the top, from the center. And yet they don't seem to be getting anywhere with it. And I'd like to know whether that impression is correct. What is the nature of the relationship between the center and the localities that seems to be blocking the efforts of these initiatives to really take flight?
Shall we hear the responses first before we move on to the second round of questions?
No, let this round get over.
What was that?
No, just 2-3 more questions.
You would like to have 2, 3?
Yeah.
All right. So the lady at the back.
I have a question, well, 2 questions for the whole panel. First, as a layperson, my understanding is that Chinese growth is more driven by foreign investment, whereas Indian growth is more driven by domestic capital. Is there any difference in terms of the consequences for foreign versus domestic-driven capital on inequality? The second question has to do with income, using income as an indicator of inequality or measurement of inequality as opposed to asset. One thing that we have found, people studying China, is that in urban China, like up to 70 to 80% of urban residents now are homeowners. And so if you don't capture that asset, or in other words, or consumption towards housing, we may be dealing with a very kind of misrepresented picture of inequality. And I want to add that even urban workers, people who have worked for their whole life in state-owned industries, actually have benefited quite substantially from the privatization of welfare housing at the end of the 90s, and they are now also homeowners, and that's why you have a 70 to 80% of residents owning homes. And are there ways to capture that kind of income or quasi-income?
Would you like to respond to this, or would you like to have more questions?
You have to decide.
All right. Let's have the responses, and then we shall proceed on to have the... Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I think I will also introduce myself later, but what is happening is, my question is that we are discussing about inequality, and I'm just wondering that the policy is about inequality, but the politics is about diversity. And my name is Makran Booth. I'm actually an architect and environmental engineer, so I'm not a professor. And I just Googled Gini coefficient to find out what it is. And why I'm popping up this question, because Professor Aziz Khan, he said something very interesting, which is the remarkable disconnect. And I think, introducing myself further, I'm working in United States. I have an office here. I'm working in India, and I'm also working in China, also in rural China. And Yao Yang, he started to describe his school, and I started to think about my school in Bastar, which is the Maoist rebellion thing. And then we were actually executing a large infrastructure, the green energy infrastructure school development in Sichuan, which is after the the Great Sichuan earthquake. So looking at the schools very closely, and again, coming back to Vamsi's, the thing, what actually, I started to look at this index, in the schools in China, we also have sports. And like if we take the indicator as sports, and then we look at the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics, and the youth of China, which is now coming up, their education in sports and music, and something which is completely missing, what Professor Aziz Khan says, the remarkable disconnect. So my question again is the inequality and the policy of inequality versus the politics of diversity, which is trying to sort of, that's all. Thank you.
Shall we have, let's just hear the responses and then we shall move on to the second question. Indeed, we have about 5 minutes left. Okay. So would you like to respond?
Okay. No, very briefly, first, the question of home ownership. Actually, in income calculation, home ownership is calculated as part of consumption and income. It's a little bit technical, but they use kind of a rent, imputed rent, to do that. Is China's growth model different from India? Well, FDI contributes quite a lot to China's economic growth, especially to exports. But I really don't think it makes a difference in terms of inequality. For Professor Riskin's question, well, if you read the official documents, not just this 12th five-year plan, you read the 11th 12th five-year plan. They are actually almost the same. Okay, so to most of us, just a lip service. Even from the central government point of view, they may not be implemented. I don't think the central government is quite serious about the plan anyway. If it involves money, those ministries can become quite serious. Okay, but even on that, most of the money is going to be spent on technological progress, I would say, and also formal education. I don't think you see kind of earmarked money going toward, say, the countryside. Okay.
Sir, if I may just abuse my role as a chairperson over here, I'd really like to hear your response to Sanjay's question about the political processes, why the alternatives path was not taken.
Well, I take note of that. It doesn't mean that I'll be able to oblige. Well, first question about investment, private and public. That was your question, what has been the shares of each? Yes. Now, investment rate has been high always. And it fell a little during the 1980s, but then it picked up again and now has gone through the roof. But the point, my guess is that private investment as proportion of total investment has increased, but I haven't seen any reliable data on that. State enterprises still remain very, very important in total investment. But then again, most of them have become mixed enterprises, collaborating between private and public. So I wouldn't know, but my answer would be that the share of private investment has increased steadily, but I still wouldn't know whether they are majority, account for more than half or not.
Can I add? I'm sorry.
Yes.
I think if you just categorize by government and the rest of the economy, when we say private, it also includes SOE. Government investment accounts for about 20% of total investment. Then the rest, 80%, is done by companies.
So it's not actually investment by individuals saving their home money and then actually investing it, because we hear about that in the U.S. a lot. That you have villagers are playing the stock market all the time with So that's not a portion of that.
No, that is important. But you see, they're investors in the sense that they do save substantially. Chinese households save a lot, and about 28 to 30% of their income. And latest year for which I have estimates, 2003, 16% of GDP accounted for household saving. There was intermediation. They were used by investors. I can't give you the details, but they are not entrepreneurs themselves. Okay? Now, about that interesting question about, Chinese development driven by foreign investment and Indian by domestic, now one has to be very careful. If you talk about foreigners financing Chinese investment, that's totally wrong. So China never had significant foreign capital inflow, see? But there was substantial foreign direct investment offset by Chinese accumulation of foreign assets, see? So the way I look at it is that that was a vehicle for technology transfer. So it is very important in that, but not in terms of financing domestic investment. You look at the entire, actually I had that on the table. China could not have accumulated 2 trillion of net external assets if its investment had been financed by foreigners. That's net external assets, see? So that, now, but the other point is very important. You are quite right that privatization of housing has actually contributed to had an equalizing effect on distribution of income, because that in-kind subsidy was highly disequalizing. Now, I think, to that very important question, who do I obey, you or the chair? See,
So if you obey me.
If you are giving me information, okay, I'm taking that in and I'm disregarding it. If you are asking me to stop, I don't know.
No, do please continue. I mean, we'd
no,
like to.
I think, that question is very important. What kind of political and social influences worked? Now, it seems to me that if you allow a certain system to go on for any period of time, you create a vested interest there. And when China went on investing in export-led development, all this investment in coastal provinces, in export development, and there may be plenty of incentives skewed in favor of exports. We really don't have a careful study of these things for China. These things, I think, solidified these vested interests, which probably prevented a shift in policies in favor of rebalancing. Because China had this marvelous opportunity when this crisis came, and its export surplus fell from nearly 10% of GDP to now about 2.5%, where all those resources could be used to create social safety net, boost personal income, personal consumption, and so on. That didn't happen. It was channeled into investment of one form or another. And I think it was largely driven by that kind of vested interest. I cannot discuss its details. I don't know.
And I have been asked to close the session. I'm very sorry, Vamsi.
You didn't even give him a chance to speak, for God's sake.
I don't need to speak. That's okay.
You'd get a chance to talk at the lunch.
I need to hear him. Maybe the other speakers.
Yes, you'd hear him at lunch.
Okay, let me speak for a minute. Maybe that's the solution. Okay, Prem Shankar Jas's question. I think, the working class, the unskilled workers broadly fall into the informal sector. So you could do it, but it's very hard, even if you work through all the occupation categories. But I'll tell you more detail. But you can do it, but it's not entirely, satisfactory. On Sanjay's question, I think it's the entrenched class structure that prevents the counterfactual, the new class structure that has emerged. So that's the very brief answer. Indian growth versus Chinese growth, I think it's the broader global regime of accumulation or capitalist accumulation that's at work in both countries. So it doesn't matter whether it's foreign capital or domestic capital. I think it's the larger regime at work, the neoliberal regime, which is entrenched in both countries. The reality of inequalities versus the politics of diversity, I think it's a very, very interesting question. Somewhere, some of these real inequalities have to be taken on. The identity struggles are excellent. I think, they brought out many contradictions that have not been discussed so far, before the 80s. Post-80s, many of those issues have come out into the open. But I think, it's time to take on a certain kind of capitalism and, put it on the defensive. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. And I apologize to the other participants who had questions. I hope that they will get the chance to talk to the speakers either during lunch or after. The lunch has been served. Thank you very much.